The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty town of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, and Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against her chest, feeling her heart hammer beneath the worn fabric of her traveling dress, as she realized her entire future waited somewhere beyond that wooden door. It was August 1882, and the journey from Boston had taken nearly 3 weeks of rattling trains and uncomfortable coaches, each mile carrying her further from the life she had known and closer to a man she had never met. Clara gathered her single carpetbag and stepped down onto the street, her legs unsteady after hours of travel. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and dust swirled around her boots as a hot wind swept through the main street. She looked around at the rough wooden buildings, the saloon with its painted sign, the general store with barrels lined up on the porch, and the livery stable where horses stamped and whinnied. Everything felt raw and unfinished compared to the brick buildings and cobblestone streets of Boston. A tall man stood near the hitching post, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He wore dusty denim pants, scuffed leather boots, and a worn shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. As Clara approached with hesitant steps, he lifted his head, and she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, with deep lines around his eyes and a mouth set in what looked like a permanent expression of quiet contemplation. He could not have been more than 30 years old, but the West had aged him in ways the East never would have. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the familiar tightness seized her throat. Why, yes, she managed, the word catching and repeating in that horrible way that had plagued her since childhood. Heat flooded her cheeks, and she looked down at the dusty street, shame washing over her as it always did when her tongue betrayed her. The man stepped closer, and she braced herself for the reaction she knew too well. The impatience, the barely concealed disgust, the way people would finish her sentences or simply walk away. That was why she had come west in the first place. In Boston, she had been a burden to her older sister's household after their parents died, unable to find work because no one wanted to hire a woman who could not speak properly. The advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like her only escape, and she had written carefully crafted letters to James Holloway, never mentioning the impediment that made her a source of pity and frustration to everyone who knew her. Name's James Holloway, but most folks call me Hall. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Clara placed hers in it. His palm was calloused and warm, and he shook her hand with a gentle firmness before releasing it. "Welcome to Silver Creek," she nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. The silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy. Finally, James picked up her carpetbag and gestured down the street. "Got a room for you at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Figured you would want some time to settle in before we talk about arrangements." Clara fell into step beside him, grateful that he did not try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She studied him from the corner of her eye as they walked. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his stride long but unhurried. Several people called out greetings as they passed, and James nodded in response but did not stop to introduce her. She was grateful for that too, Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a 2-story structure at the end of the main street, painted white with green shutters that gave it a more civilized appearance than most of the other buildings. A robust woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun opened the door before they even reached the porch steps. "You must be Miss Whitmore," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. Come in, come in. I have got a nice room ready for you on the 2nd floor." Clara managed a small smile and followed Mrs. Patterson inside, acutely aware of James behind her. The interior was clean and surprisingly comfortable, with lace curtains at the windows and a flowered carpet in the hallway. Mrs. Patterson led them up a narrow staircase to a small room with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. "I will let you get settled," James said from the doorway. He seemed to fill the entire frame with his presence, and Clara felt suddenly very small and alone. "Would you like to have supper with me this evening? There is a decent restaurant across from the hotel, nothing fancy, but the food is good." Clara's throat tightened again, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. They were hazel, she realized, with flecks of gold that caught the light from the window. Why, yes," she said, the words stuttering out despite her best efforts. Th, thank you." Something shifted in his expression, but it was not the impatience or mockery she expected. His eyes softened slightly, and he gave a small nod. "I will come by at 6. That give you enough time?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. After he left, she sank down on the edge of the bed and covered her face with her hands. What had she been thinking coming all this way? She had thought perhaps in letters she could hide her shame, could present herself as someone worth marrying. But now James Holloway knew the truth, and she could already imagine the pity in his eyes, or worse, the regret. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Clara had changed into her only other dress, a blue cotton that was starting to show wear at the cuffs, but was still respectable. She had brushed out her dark hair and pinned it up as best she could without a proper mirror, and she had pinched her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. When she opened the door, James stood there with his hat in his hands, his hair still damp as though he had just washed. "You look nice," he said simply, and offered his arm. The restaurant was crowded with ranch hands and townspeople, all talking and laughing in the easy way of people who had known each other for years. Clara felt every eye turn toward them as they entered, and she kept her gaze fixed on the floor as James led her to a table in the corner. He held out her chair and she sat gratefully, her hands twisted together in her lap. A young woman with red hair came over with a smile. "Evening, Hall. What can I get you folks?" "2 steaks, if you got them, Annie, and whatever vegetables are fresh today." James looked at Clara. "That all right with you?" Clara nodded quickly, relieved that he had ordered for her so she did not have to struggle through words in front of the waitress. After Annie left, James leaned back in his chair and studied Clara with an expression she could not quite read. "I suppose we should talk about expectations," he said. "I am not much for pretty words or fancy speeches, so I will just be plain. I own a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. Nothing huge, but I got a good herd of cattle and enough land to make a decent living. House needs some work, but it is solid. I am looking for a wife because the work is hard and lonely, and I figure it is time to build something more than just a ranch." Clara listened, her heart sinking with each word. He was outlining a business arrangement, nothing more. She supposed she should not have expected anything different. Mail-order marriages were transactions, after all. But some foolish part of her had hoped for something more, even though she knew she had nothing to offer. "I know you came a long way, and I appreciate that," James continued. "But I want you to know that you are not obligated to anything yet. You can take some time, get to know the town, see if you think you could build a life here. If you decide it is not for you, I will pay your passage back to Boston, no hard feelings." Clara's eyes snapped up to meet his, surprise washing through her. She had used nearly every cent she had to purchase the ticket west. If this did not work out, she would have no way to return, no place to go. The fact that he was offering her an escape route, that he was not demanding she fulfill the bargain immediately, loosened something tight in her chest. "Th, that is KK kind," she managed, forcing the words out despite how they caught and stumbled. James leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Miss Whitmore, I am going to say something and I want you to really hear it." He waited until she met his eyes again. "You got a stutter, I noticed, but that does not change anything about why you are here or what I am offering. Words are just one way people communicate, and far as I can tell, you got plenty to say. The way I see it, if something is worth saying, it is worth the time it takes to say it. So you take all the time you need and I will listen." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked rapidly to keep them from falling. In 24 years, no one had ever said anything like that to her. Her parents had tried various cures and remedies, had taken her to doctors who prescribed breathing exercises and had her read aloud until her throat was raw. Her sister had always looked embarrassed when Clara stuttered in public, hurrying her along or speaking for her. Teachers had called her lazy and inattentive, assuming her stutter was a sign of a slow mind rather than just a rebellious tongue. But this cowboy, this rough man of the West who barely knew her, had just told her that every word of hers mattered. She opened her mouth to respond, but Annie arrived with their food and the moment passed. As they ate, James talked in his slow, unhurried way about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, about the challenges of the upcoming winter and his plans to expand the herd in the spring. Clara listened, grateful that he did not press her to speak, and gradually she began to relax. His voice was soothing, and she found herself fascinated by the way he described the land, with a quiet passion that showed how much he loved it. "You ever ridden a horse?" he asked as they finished their meal. Clara shook her head. "Would you like to learn? I could take you out to the ranch tomorrow, show you around. No pressure," he added quickly. "Just thought you might want to see the place before you make any decisions." "I would like that," Clara said, and though the words were difficult, she meant them with her whole heart. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Clara met James at the livery stable where he had 2 horses saddled and waiting. One was a large bay gelding that he swung onto with practiced ease, and the other was a smaller gray mare with a gentle eye. "This is Willow," James said, patting the mare's neck. "She is about the calmest horse I got. Just hold the reins like this and keep your heels down in the stirrups." Getting into the saddle was awkward, and Clara was certain she looked ridiculous in her dress hiked up to show her petticoats and boots. But James did not laugh. He adjusted her stirrups and showed her how to hold her hands, his touch impersonal but patient. When they finally set off down the road leading out of town, Clara clutched the saddle horn with white knuckles, certain she was going to fall at any moment. But Willow was indeed gentle, plodding along beside James's bay with steady, even steps. As the town fell away behind them and the landscape opened up into rolling grassland dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers, Clara began to breathe easier. The sky was an endless blue dome overhead, unmarred by the smoke and buildings of the city, and the air smelled of warm earth and growing things. In the distance, mountains rose up purple and hazy, and she could see the dark shapes of cattle scattered across the hills. "It is beautiful," she said, and the words came out smooth and easy, surprising her. James glanced over with a small smile. "It grows on you." "First time I saw this country, I thought it was the loneliest place on earth. Now I cannot imagine being anywhere else." They rode for nearly an hour before a cluster of buildings appeared in a small valley. The ranch house was a simple structure made of logs, with a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from one end. Nearby stood a barn, a chicken coop, and several corrals. It was rough and unfinished, but there was something appealing about it, something solid and real. James dismounted and came to help Clara down. Her legs were shaky when her feet hit the ground, and she would have stumbled if he had not steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Takes some getting used to," he said, "but you did real well for a first time." He showed her around the property, pointing out the well he had dug himself, the vegetable garden that had gone mostly to weeds because he did not have time to tend it properly, and the hen house where a dozen chickens scratched and clucked. Inside the house, Clara found a single large room that served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a rough wooden table and chairs in the center. A ladder led up to a loft space under the rafters, and a doorway opened into a small bedroom at the back. "I know it is not much," James said, sounding almost apologetic. "Been meaning to add on another room, maybe a proper parlor, and the place could use a woman's touch. I am not much for decorating." Clara walked slowly around the room, taking in the bare walls, the simple furnishings, the lack of curtains or rugs or any of the small comforts that made a house a home. But beneath the roughness, she could see the potential. The fireplace was well built, the floorboards were solid, and the windows let in good light. It was a place that could be made into something beautiful with time and care. "I like it," she said, turning to face James. "It feels honest." Something in his expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "That is a good word for it. What you see is what you get out here. No pretense, no putting on airs, just hard work and the land." They spent the rest of the morning at the ranch. James showed her how to gather eggs from the henhouse, and though the chickens startled her with their sudden movements and loud squawking, she managed to collect nearly a dozen eggs in the basket he provided. He took her out to see the cattle grazing in the near pasture, pointing out the different breeds and explaining his plans for breeding. Clara found herself fascinated by the way he talked about the animals, with a mixture of practicality and genuine affection. When the sun was high overhead, they sat on the porch steps and ate the lunch Mrs. Patterson had packed for them, simple sandwiches and apples, with water from the well to wash it down. The heat was intense, but a slight breeze made it bearable, and Clara found herself feeling more relaxed than she had in years. There was something about this place, about the vast open spaces and the quietness, that soothed the constant anxiety that usually knotted her stomach. "Can I ask you something?" James said, brushing crumbs from his hands. Clara tensed slightly but nodded. "Why did you answer my advertisement? A woman like you, educated, from a good family based on your letters. You could have found a husband back east." Clara was quiet for a long moment, trying to figure out how to explain. Finally, she took a deep breath and forced the words out, one careful syllable at a time. "No one WW wanted me, be because of this." She gestured vaguely at her throat. "My PP parents D died 3 years ago. My S sister T took me in, B but I W was a B burden. C could not F find W work. C could not F find a H husband. I th thought M may be here where P people D do not KN know me, I C could have a CH chance." James listened without interrupting, his eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your sister sounds like a fool. Anyone who sees you as a burden is not looking at you properly." The simple declaration, stated as plain fact rather than empty flattery, made Clara's throat tighten for an entirely different reason. She looked away, blinking rapidly against the tears that threatened to fall. "I meant what I said last night," James continued. "Every word of yours matters, and for what it is worth, I am glad you answered my advertisement. I think you got a lot of courage, coming all this way to start over." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the cattle graze and listening to the wind move through the grass. Finally, James stood and offered her his hand. "Should probably head back to town before it gets too late. But I would like to see you again if you are willing. Maybe tomorrow I could show you around Silver Creek proper, introduce you to some folks." Over the next 2 weeks, Clara saw James nearly every day. He took her to meet the shopkeepers on the main street, introduced her to the doctor and his wife, and brought her to the church where a circuit preacher held services twice a month. The people of Silver Creek were curious about her, and she could see the questions in their eyes when she struggled to speak. But James never seemed embarrassed or impatient. He would wait calmly for her to finish her sentences, and gradually people began to follow his lead, giving her the time and space she needed. Clara also spent time with Mrs. Patterson, who turned out to be a wealth of information about the town and its inhabitants. Over tea in the boarding house parlor, the older woman told her about the various families, the feuds and friendships, the hardships and triumphs. She also gave Clara practical advice about life in the West, about the harsh winters and the importance of community, about the skills she would need to manage a ranch household. "James Holloway is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon, fixing Clara with a knowing look. "Lost his parents when he was young, grew up working on other people's ranches until he saved enough to buy his own land. He has worked hard for everything he has got, and he does not take it for granted. You could do a lot worse." "I can know," Clara said softly, and she did know. With each day that passed, she found herself drawn to James in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. It was not just his patience with her stutter, though that meant more than she could express. It was the way he looked at the land with such love, the way he treated his animals with firm kindness, the way he spoke to everyone with the same level respect, whether they were the town banker or the man who mucked out stables. He was steady and solid in a way she had never encountered before, and she was starting to realize that she wanted to build a life with him. But did he feel the same way? He was always courteous and thoughtful, but he had never tried to kiss her or even hold her hand beyond helping her on and off her horse. Sometimes, she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, but he always looked away before she could puzzle it out. 3 weeks after her arrival, James invited her to a dance at the town hall. Clara's first instinct was to refuse, because the thought of socializing with so many people, of having to navigate conversations with her halting speech, made her stomach churn with anxiety. But James had been so kind, and she did not want to disappoint him, so she agreed. Mrs. Patterson helped her get ready, lending her a nicer dress in a deep green that brought out the color of Clara's eyes, and pinning her hair up in an elegant style that made her look older and more sophisticated. When Clara came down the stairs and saw James waiting in the parlor, his eyes widened slightly. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. The town hall was packed with people, and a small group of musicians in the corner were playing lively fiddle music. James kept Clara close to his side as they navigated through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Several people greeted them, and Clara managed brief responses, though her stutter was worse in the noisy, crowded environment. When the music shifted to a slower melody, James turned to her. "Would you dance with me? I should warn you, I am not very good at it." Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but she nodded and let him lead her onto the floor. He placed one hand at her waist and took her hand in his other, and they began to move in a simple pattern. He was right that he was not a particularly skilled dancer, but there was something endearing about the way he concentrated, his brow furrowed slightly as he tried not to step on her feet. "I have been wanting to ask you something," James said as they swayed together. "You have been here almost a month now. Have you given any thought to whether you want to stay? I do not mean to rush you, but I figure it is fair to know where we stand." Clara looked up at him, at the serious expression on his weathered face, and felt her heart swell with an emotion she was almost afraid to name. "I want to stay," she said clearly. "I want to marry you if the offer is still open." James stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the floor, and stared at her. For a terrifying moment, Clara thought she had misread everything, that he was going to tell her he had changed his mind. But then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious expression into something warm and wonderful. "The offer is definitely still open," he said. "More than that, I want you to know that I have come to care for you, Clara." This started as a practical arrangement, at least on my part, but somewhere along the way it became something more. "I love the way you see beauty in simple things. I love how hard you try, even when things are difficult. I love your quiet strength. And I love every word you say, no matter how long it takes to say it." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "I love you too," she whispered, and the words came out easier than any words ever had. James pulled her close, right there in front of everyone, and kissed her. It was her first kiss, gentle and sweet, and it tasted like hope and promise and new beginnings. Around them, people began to clap and cheer, but Clara barely heard them. All she knew was the feeling of James's arms around her, solid and sure, and the knowledge that she had finally found a place where she belonged. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church. Clara wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Patterson and some of the other town women had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair that James had picked himself that morning. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony, and when it came time for Clara to say her vows, She took a deep breath and spoke slowly and carefully, her voice shaking but clear. I, C. Clara Whitmore, T. Take you, J. James Holloway, to be my L. lawfully W. wedded husband. I PR promise to L. love you, to since stand by your S. side, to be build a L. life with you, for be better or W. worse, as L. long as we be both shall L. live. James's eyes were suspiciously bright as he repeated his own vows, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her with such tenderness that Clara felt her heart might burst from happiness. The town threw them a small celebration at the restaurant, with food and music and dancing. People she barely knew came up to wish them well, and Clara was touched by their genuine warmth. She was starting to understand what Mrs. Patterson had meant about the importance of community. Out here on the frontier, people depended on each other, and they welcomed those who were willing to work hard and contribute. As the sun began to set, James helped Clara onto Willow, and they rode out to the ranch together as husband and wife. The house looked different in the golden evening light, less rough and more like home. James had clearly spent time preparing for her arrival. There were new curtains at the windows, made from simple fabric but sewn with care. A colorful rag rug covered the floor near the fireplace, and wild flowers in a jar sat on the table. I know it is not fancy, James said, looking almost nervous, but I wanted it to feel welcoming. It is perfect, Clara said, and meant it with her whole heart. That night, as they lay together in the small bedroom, James held her close and stroked her hair. I am going to make you happy, he murmured. I promise you that. Clara pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. You already have, she whispered. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Clara had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the endless chores that needed doing from sunup to sundown. She learned to milk the cow James bought, to churn butter, to tend the vegetable garden and coax it back to life. She learned to cook on the wood stove, though her first several attempts at bread were dense and nearly inedible. James ate them anyway, claiming they were the best bricks he had ever tasted, and his teasing made her laugh despite her frustration. She also learned to read the weather, to watch for signs of storms rolling down from the mountains. She learned the names of all the cattle, or at least the ones close to the house, and she learned to recognize the different calls and sounds that meant danger or distress. James was a patient teacher, never making her feel stupid for not knowing things that seemed second nature to him. In turn, Clara brought changes to the ranch that James clearly appreciated. She sewed new shirts for him, mended his worn clothes, and made the house feel warm and lived in. She started a small flower garden near the porch, and though James teased her about the impracticality of growing things that could not be eaten, she caught him smiling at the bright blooms more than once. She also began keeping a record book, carefully tracking expenses and income in her neat handwriting, which James admitted was far better than his own haphazard system. But the best part of their new life together was the easy companionship they developed. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes James would talk about his plans for the ranch, his dreams of expanding the herd and maybe buying more land. Sometimes Clara would read aloud from the few books they owned, her stutter barely noticeable when she was relaxed and there was no pressure. And sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, content in each other's presence. Clara's stutter did not magically disappear, of course. There were still days when her anxiety made it worse, when the words seemed to pile up in her throat and refuse to come out properly. But with James, she never felt ashamed of it. He never finished her sentences or looked impatient. He just waited, with that calm steadiness that was so much a part of him, and listened to whatever she had to say. One afternoon in late autumn, as they worked together to bring the cattle closer to the ranch in preparation for winter, Clara noticed that one of the cows was limping badly. She pointed it out to James, who rode over to investigate. "Looks like she stepped in a hole and twisted her leg," he said, examining the injury carefully. "Not broken, but she's going to need some rest and care. Can you help me get her into the barn?" Working together, they managed to guide the injured cow into one of the stalls. James showed Clara how to wrap the leg to provide support, and over the next several days, they took turns checking on the animal and making sure she had food and water. The cow, whom Clara had named Buttercup for the yellow patches on her hide, slowly recovered, and there was something deeply satisfying about being part of that healing process. Winter arrived early that year, with snow beginning to fall in mid-November. James had warned Clara about the harsh Montana winters, but she had not truly understood until the first blizzard hit. For 3 days, snow fell so thick and fast that they could not see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The wind howled like a living thing, and drifts piled up higher than Clara's head. They were trapped in the house, and James made regular trips to the barn to care for the animals, coming back each time covered in snow and shaking with cold. Clara kept the fire burning constantly, melting snow for water and cooking hearty stews that would stick to their ribs. At night, they huddled together under every blanket they owned, and James told her stories about other winters, about times when cattle froze standing up and people got lost between their house and barn. The stories were meant to be educational, Clara thought, but they mostly just terrified her. When the storm finally broke and they were able to dig out, James took stock of the damage. They had lost 2 calves and one of the older cows, which James explained was actually better than he had feared. Other ranchers in the area had lost far more. The work of caring for the herd through winter was relentless, hauling hay and breaking ice on the water troughs, checking for frostbite and illness. Clara worked alongside James, learning to push through exhaustion and cold, learning that survival out here required a toughness she had never needed in Boston. One particularly brutal day in January, when the temperature had dropped so low that their breath froze in the air, Clara was helping James carry hay to the cattle when she slipped on a patch of ice. She went down hard, crying out as pain shot through her wrist. James was at her side in an instant, his face tight with concern. "Let me see," he said, carefully examining her arm. When he tried to move her wrist, Clara gasped at the sharp pain. "I think it might be broken. We need to get you to Doc Harrison." The trip into town was agonizing, every bump in the road sending jolts of pain up Clara's arm. Doc Harrison confirmed that the wrist was indeed fractured and set it with practiced efficiency, wrapping it in a splint and giving strict instructions for care. "You are going to need to take it easy for at least 6 weeks, the doctor said firmly. "No heavy lifting, no hauling water or firewood. That means you are going to have your hands full, James, doing her work and yours too." James just nodded. "We will manage." And they did, though it was not easy. James took over all of Clara's usual chores in addition to his own, working from before dawn until after dark. Clara did what she could with one hand, cooking and mending and keeping the house warm, but she chafed at her helplessness. She had never been good at sitting idle, and watching James exhaust himself while she could do little to help was frustrating. One evening, as James came in from the barn looking half dead on his feet, Clara met him at the door with tears in her eyes. "I am SOS sorry," she said. "ISH should have been more see careful. Why you are W working yourself tita d-death be because of me." James pulled her close, careful of her injured arm. "Stop that," he said gently. "Accidents happen. You think I have never gotten hurt. Last year I broke 3 ribs when a horse kicked me. The year before that I got laid up for a week with a fever. That is just life out here. We take care of each other. That is what marriage is." His words helped, but Clara still felt guilty. She tried to find ways to be useful despite her injury, doing small tasks that did not require 2 hands. She organized their supplies, making lists of what they would need to buy in the spring. She started planning a larger garden, sketching out ideas for what to plant. And she spent time with the animals, particularly the horses, learning their personalities and building trust. Willow, the gentle gray mare, became her special friend. Clara would spend hours in the barn, talking softly to the horse while brushing her coat with her good hand. She found that her stutter was less pronounced when she talked to animals, and Willow seemed to enjoy the attention, nickering softly and nuzzling Clara's shoulder. One day, James came into the barn to find Clara sitting on a bale of hay, tears streaming down her face while Willow stood nearby looking concerned. He immediately sat down beside her and pulled her close. "What is wrong?" he asked, his voice full of worry. Clara struggled to speak through her tears and her stutter. "I just realized how happy I am," she managed. "And it scares me because I never thought I could have this. I thought would always be all alone." James kissed the top of her head. "You are never going to be alone again," he said firmly. "I am here and I am not going anywhere. We are going to grow old together, you and me. We are going to build something lasting." By the time spring arrived, Clara's wrist had healed, though it ached when the weather changed. The snow melted, turning the ground to mud, and then the grass began to grow, turning the brown landscape green seemingly overnight. Clara threw herself into planting the garden, working the soil and setting seeds with a sense of purpose and hope. James built her raised beds to make the work easier, and she planted vegetables and herbs, carefully marking each row. As the weather warmed, other ranchers began stopping by and Clara got to know their neighbors. There was Bill and Martha Thompson, who ran a larger spread about 10 miles north. Martha was a brisk, practical woman who took Clara under her wing, teaching her about preserving food and making soap, and all the other skills necessary for frontier life. There was also young Tommy Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China and established a small ranch with determination and hard work, despite facing considerable prejudice from some of the other settlers. Tommy was only a few years younger than James, and the two had become friends, helping each other with difficult tasks and sharing resources when needed. One day in May, Martha pulled Clara aside during a visit. "How are you feeling lately?" she asked with a knowing look. Clara blinked in surprise. "Fine. Why?" Martha smiled. "Just seems like you have been looking a bit peaked in the mornings, and I noticed you barely touched the eggs at breakfast." Clara's hand went to her stomach as understanding dawned. She had not let herself think about it, but now that Martha mentioned it, she realized she had missed her monthly courses and had indeed been feeling queasy in the mornings. "Do you think?" "I think you should go see Doc Harrison," Martha said gently. "But yes, I think you might be expecting." "How do you feel about that?" Clara's emotions were a complicated tangle. Fear, excitement, worry, joy, all mixed together until she could barely sort one from another. "I do not know," she admitted. "We have not talked about children." "Well, you better talk about it now," Martha said with a laugh, "because if I am right, you have got about 7 months to prepare." That evening, Clara waited until after supper to tell James. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their habit, and she twisted her hands together nervously before finally speaking. "I think I might be going to have a bee baby," she said, the words tumbling out faster than usual. James went very still. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide. "Truly," she nodded. Martha said I should see the doctor to BBS sure, but she thinks so." For a long moment, James just stared at her. Then his face broke into the biggest smile Clara had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that sent the chickens scattering. He stood and pulled her to her feet, spinning her around before remembering to be gentle and setting her down carefully. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." Doc Harrison confirmed the pregnancy the next day, and suddenly Clara found herself at the center of attention from all the women in the area. They showered her with advice, some of it helpful and some of it contradictory, and began working on baby clothes and blankets. James became almost comically protective, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard, until Clara finally had to sit him down and explain that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was not made of glass. "I can know you want to keep me as safe," she said, taking his hands in hers. "But I need to since stay useful. I need to feel like I am since still contributing. So please, let me do the things I can do, and I promise I will ask for help when I need it." James reluctantly agreed, though Clara caught him watching her constantly, ready to jump in if she showed any sign of struggling. It was both endearing and exasperating, and she loved him all the more for it. As summer progressed, and Clara's belly began to swell with new life, she found herself thinking about the future in ways she never had before. She wondered what kind of mother she would be, whether her child would inherit her stutter, how they would manage with an infant when the work of the ranch was already so demanding. But whenever her worries threatened to overwhelm her, James was there, steady and reassuring, reminding her that they would figure it out together. In August, exactly 1 year after Clara had arrived in Silver Creek, James surprised her by taking her into town for what he said was a special errand. He led her to the general store where a large crate sat waiting. "What is this?" Clara asked, puzzled. "Open it and see," James said with a mysterious smile. Inside the crate, carefully packed in straw, was a beautiful rocking chair made of polished wood. It was clearly crafted with skill and care, with smooth, curved rockers and comfortable armrests. Clara ran her hand over the wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. "James, it is beautiful," she breathed. "But how?" "Been saving up," he said, looking pleased with her reaction. "Figured you would need a good chair for rocking the baby. Had it made special by a furniture maker over in Billings. Happy anniversary." Clara threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. She had been so caught up in the daily work of survival that she had not even realized the date. But James had remembered, had planned this surprise, had spent precious money on something that was beautiful rather than merely practical. It was proof, if she had needed any, of how much he loved her. They loaded the chair into the wagon and brought it home, and James set it up in the corner of their bedroom where Clara could rock and look out the window at the mountains. That night, she sat in it for the first time, and the smooth motion soothed both her body and her spirit. James sat on the floor beside her, his hand resting on her rounded belly, and they talked about names and plans and dreams for their growing family. Autumn came again, and with it the endless work of preparing for winter. But this time they had help. Tommy Chen and Bill Thompson came by regularly, assisting James with the heavier tasks and making sure they had enough firewood and supplies laid in. The women checked on Clara frequently, bringing food and company, easing the isolation that could be so hard during the long winter months. In late October, Clara woke in the middle of the night with a sharp pain low in her back. She lay quietly for a moment, wondering if she had just slept wrong, but then another pain came, stronger this time, wrapping around her belly like a vice. Beside her, James stirred. "Clara, what is wrong?" "I think it is tea time," she said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. It was too early, nearly a month before the baby was due. James was up in an instant, lighting the lamp with shaking hands. "I will ride to town and get Doc Harrison and Martha," he said, pulling on his clothes. The next hours were a blur of pain and fear. Martha arrived first, her presence calm and reassuring as she helped Clara through the contractions. Doc Harrison came soon after, and he examined Clara with a serious expression. "The baby is coming early, but that happens sometimes," he said. "Everything looks all right so far. You are doing fine, Clara." But it did not feel fine. The pain was worse than anything Clara had ever experienced, and it seemed to go on forever. She gripped Martha's hand so hard she was probably leaving bruises, and she could hear James pacing in the other room, his footsteps a constant rhythm that somehow helped her focus. Finally, as dawn light began to seep through the windows, she felt an overwhelming urge to push. Martha and Doc Harrison coached her through it, and then suddenly there was a release of pressure and a thin, reedy cry filled the room. "It is a boy," Doc Harrison announced, holding up a tiny, red-faced infant covered in blood and vernix. Small, but he looks healthy. Clara burst into tears as the doctor laid the baby on her chest. He was so tiny, his skin wrinkled and his eyes squeezed shut, but he was alive and crying and absolutely perfect. She looked up to see James standing in the doorway, his face streaked with tears, and she managed an exhausted smile. "Come and meet your son," she said softly. James crossed the room in 2 strides and sank down beside the bed, staring at the baby in wonder. "He is so small," he whispered. "He is going to be fine," Doc Harrison said, washing his hands in the basin. "Early, but not dangerously so. He has got good lungs on him, that is for sure. What are you going to name him?" Clara looked at James, and they had a silent conversation in the way couples do. They had discussed names, but somehow none of them seemed quite right now that their son was actually here. Finally, Clara spoke. "William," she said clearly, without a single stutter. "William James Holloway." Their son, Will as they quickly began calling him, was indeed small but healthy. He ate constantly, his tiny mouth working furiously at Clara's breast, and he seemed to grow almost visibly day by day. Clara was exhausted and overwhelmed, and more in love than she had ever thought possible. James was a devoted father from the start, taking Will in his large, calloused hands with surprising gentleness, and walking him around the house in the middle of the night when he fussed. The first winter with a baby was challenging. Clara barely slept, between nursing and changing and the constant worry that something would go wrong. James took over even more of the household tasks, and their neighbors continued to help, bringing food and supplies and giving Clara brief reprieves when she could sleep or bathe or simply sit without a baby in her arms. But there were also moments of pure joy. Will's first smile, the way his eyes lit up when he saw Clara or James, the small sounds he made that seemed almost like conversation. Clara would sit in her rocking chair by the window, nursing her son while watching snow fall outside, and feel a contentment so deep it was almost painful. One night, when Will was about 3 months old, James came to bed and found Clara crying silently, tears streaming down her face while she stared at their sleeping son in his cradle. "What is wrong?" James asked immediately, sitting beside her. "And nothing is wrong," Clara said, wiping at her tears. "I am just so grateful. Do you remember what you said to me that first night, that every W word of mine mattered?" James nodded, pulling her close. "No one had ever said anything like that to me before," Clara continued. "All my life, people made me feel like I was less than, like my since stutter made me broken or since stupid or not worth the trouble, but you saw me as a whole person. You gave me a chance. And now I have all this." She gestured at the room, at Will sleeping peacefully at their life together. "I have more than I ever doctor dreamed possible, and it scares me sometimes how much I have to lose." James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "You are not going to lose it. We have built something strong here, Clara, something that will last. And as for your stutter, I am going to tell you something. I do not even hear it anymore. When you talk, all I hear is your voice, your thoughts, your heart. The stutter is just part of how you speak, same as my rough hands are part of how I work. It does not define you." Clara pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself cry, releasing all the fear and gratitude and overwhelming love that filled her heart. As Will grew from an infant to a toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. James expanded the herd and bought more land, and Clara's garden provided enough vegetables to get them through the winter with plenty to preserve. They added a room onto the house, a proper parlor with real glass windows and a wood floor, and Clara made curtains and bought a few pieces of furniture to make it comfortable. Will was a happy, energetic child who babbled constantly in that peculiar language of toddlers. Clara watched him carefully for signs of a stutter, her heart in her throat every time he struggled over a word. But as he grew older and his speech developed, It became clear that he had inherited his father's easy way of talking. Clara was relieved, though a small part of her felt almost sad. She had thought perhaps if Will stuttered too, she could help him, could save him from some of the pain and shame she had endured. But Will had his own challenges. He was small for his age, like his mother, and he had her dark hair and serious eyes. He was quiet in crowds, overwhelmed by too much noise and activity, and he had a sensitive nature that made him cry easily. James taught him about the ranch, letting him help with small tasks, and Clara taught him letters and numbers, using a primer she had ordered from a catalog. When Will was 2, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and she carried the baby to full term. In April of 1886, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. The birth was faster than Will's had been, and Sarah came into the world with a lusty cry that announced her personality from the start. Where Will was serious and thoughtful, Sarah was bold and adventurous. As soon as she could crawl, she was getting into everything, and James joked that they were going to have their hands full with this one. Life fell into a rhythm. The work was hard and never-ending, but it was also deeply satisfying. Clara's garden expanded until it was the pride of the county, and Martha convinced her to enter some of her preserves in the county fair. To Clara's shock, she won a blue ribbon for her strawberry jam, and suddenly she had people asking to buy her preserves. She started making extra, and the income, though modest, gave her a sense of pride and independence. James's herd continued to grow, and he gained a reputation as a fair dealer and a skilled rancher. People came from miles around to buy his cattle, and he was elected to the board that regulated grazing rights and water access in the area. Clara was proud of his accomplishments, and she could see how he had grown in confidence over the years. But the West was changing. The open range was being fenced, and conflicts between ranchers and farmers were increasing. The railroad had come to Montana, bringing more settlers and more competition. Some of the old-timers grumbled about how things were not like they used to be, and there was a sense that an era was ending. One evening, when Will was 5 and Sarah was 3, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was well-dressed in a suit that marked him as a city man, and he had the confident bearing of someone used to getting his way. James invited him in, and over coffee, the man introduced himself as a representative of a large cattle company based in Chicago. "We are buying up ranches in this area," he said bluntly. "I am prepared to make you a very generous offer for your land and your herd, Mr. Holloway." James listened politely as the man laid out the details. It was indeed a generous offer, enough money to live comfortably for years. But when the man finished, James shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but I am not interested in selling," he said firmly. "This ranch is my home. I built it from nothing, and I plan to pass it on to my children." The man tried to argue, pointing out the challenges facing independent ranchers, the uncertainty of the future, but James remained firm. Finally, the man left, clearly frustrated, and James closed the door behind him with a sigh. "Do you think we made a mistake?" Clara asked quietly. "That was a lot of money." James pulled her close. "Money is not everything. This place, what we have built here, that is worth more than any amount of cash. Our children are going to grow up knowing where they come from, knowing the value of hard work. That is worth more than a comfortable life in some city." Clara nodded, trusting his judgment, and as the years passed, she was glad they had stayed. The ranch continued to prosper, and their children grew strong and healthy. Will showed an aptitude for working with horses, and by the time he was 10, he could break and train even the most stubborn animals with patience and skill. Sarah was fearless, riding before she could barely walk, and she had her father's love of the land. Clara's stutter never went away, but it mattered less and less as time went on. The people of Silver Creek knew her and accepted her, and she had built a reputation as a skilled gardener and preserver. She also became known as someone people could turn to for help. When a neighbor was sick, Clara was there with food and assistance. When a child needed teaching, she opened her home and shared her knowledge. She had found her place in this community, and it was a good place. One autumn day, when Clara was 35 and Will was 13, she realized she had not thought about Boston in years. The city where she had been born and raised, the place where she had been made to feel ashamed and inadequate, had faded to a distant memory. This was her home now, this raw land with its harsh winters and its breathtaking beauty. These were her people, the farmers and ranchers and townspeople who had welcomed her and given her a chance. She was standing in her garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first frost, when James came to find her. He looked older now, with silver threading through his dark hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but he was still strong and capable, still the steady presence that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "Remember when you first got here?" he asked, leaning against the fence and watching her work. "You were so scared, so uncertain. Look at you now. You are the strongest woman I know." Clara straightened up, pushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I was not SDR strong," she said. "I was desperate. There is a D difference." "Maybe you started out desperate," James conceded. "But you became strong. You made a life here, Clara. You made a home. And you raised 2 incredible children. That takes strength." Clara walked over to him and took his hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. "We did it together," she said. "I could not have done any of it without you." James pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "That goes both ways. This ranch is as much yours as it is mine. More, maybe. You are the heart of it." In the distance, they could hear Will and Sarah's voices as they brought the cattle in from the far pasture. Their children, growing up strong and confident, carrying forward the legacy they were building. Clara thought about the terrified young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 14 years ago, ashamed of her stutter and convinced she had nothing to offer. If she could see herself now, would she believe it? That winter was particularly harsh, with blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that plunged below zero. The work of keeping the cattle alive was brutal, and James spent long hours in the cold, checking on the herd and hauling feed. Will worked alongside him, learning the hard lessons of ranching, while Clara and Sarah managed the house and the animals closer to home. One night, James came in from the barn looking worried. "One of the pregnant cows is having trouble," he said. "I think the calf is breech." "I am going to need help." Clara bundled up in every warm thing she owned and followed James out into the bitter cold. In the barn, the cow was lying on her side, clearly in distress. James examined her quickly and nodded. "Breech, like I thought. We are going to have to turn the calf." What followed was an exhausting battle against time and nature. James reached inside the cow, trying to reposition the calf, while Clara held the cow's head and tried to keep her calm. It seemed to take forever, but finally James gave a grunt of satisfaction. "Got it. Here it comes." The calf slid out in a rush of fluid, and for a terrifying moment it lay still. Then James cleared its nose and mouth, and the calf gave a shaky breath and began to move. The cow, exhausted, struggled to her feet and began licking her baby clean. "We did it," James said, his voice full of relief. He looked at Clara, and even in the dim light of the lantern she could see the love in his eyes. "We make a good team, you and me," Clara smiled, despite her exhaustion and the cold that had seeped into her bones. "Always have," she said, without a single stutter. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it new growth and renewed hope. Clara was in her garden, planning her planting, when a wagon rolled up the drive. To her surprise, Martha Thompson climbed down, followed by several other women from town. "What is this?" Clara asked, confused. Martha smiled. "We are here for a quilting bee. You have been so busy with the ranch and the children that we figured we would bring the social to you." The women set up in the parlor, and Clara found herself surrounded by friends, laughing and talking while their hands worked on creating a beautiful quilt. It was moments like this that reminded her how far she had come. She was no longer the isolated, ashamed woman who had arrived in Silver Creek. She was part of something larger, part of a community that valued her for who she was. As the years continued to pass, Clara watched her children grow into young adults. Will, at 18, was as tall as his father and had his steady, quiet nature. He was courting a girl from town, the daughter of the baker, and Clara suspected an engagement was not far off. Sarah, at 16, was wild and beautiful, with her father's love of the land and her mother's fierce determination. She talked about becoming a veterinarian, though such a path was unusual for a woman. James was in his late 40s now, and the hard years of ranching were beginning to show. His back bothered him on cold mornings, and he moved a bit slower than he once had. But he was still strong, still capable, and he had built something lasting. The ranch was one of the most successful in the county, and the Holloway name was respected. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to Clara. "You ever regret it?" Answering that advertisement, coming out here. Clara thought about the question seriously. She thought about the fear and uncertainty of those early days, about the harsh winters and the hard work, about the loneliness and the struggle. But she also thought about the love she had found, the family she had built, the person she had become. "Not F for a S single M moment," she said clearly. "This is where I was meant to be, with you." James took her hand, their fingers intertwining in the familiar way of a couple who had spent decades together. "Every word of yours matters," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken so many years ago. "Every word, every moment, every day with you has been a gift." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, watching as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. In the distance, she could hear Will and Sarah laughing about something, their voices full of joy and life. The cattle lowed in their pastures, the chickens settled in for the night, and the wind whispered through the grass. This was her life. This was her home. And it was more than she had ever dared to dream. Several more years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow. Will married his sweetheart, Emma, and brought her to live on the ranch. They built a small house on the far side of the property, and soon Clara had a grandson, a sturdy boy named after James. Sarah surprised everyone by becoming engaged to a young doctor who had recently moved to Silver Creek. He supported her ambitions, and together they planned to open a practice that would treat both people and animals. James's back continued to trouble him, and there were days when he moved stiffly, when Clara caught him wincing in pain. But he refused to slow down, still riding out each day to check the herd, still making sure everything was running smoothly. Clara worried about him, but she knew better than to try to change who he was. One spring morning, when Clara was 50 and James 52, she woke to find him already dressed and pulling on his boots. "Where are you going so early?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Want to check on the herd in the north pasture," James said. "Will mentioned one of the cows looked sick yesterday. Should not take more than a couple hours." Clara got up and made him breakfast, and they ate together in comfortable silence. Before he left, James pulled her close and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment. "I love you," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "More than anything in this world." "I'll love you too," Clara replied, smiling up at him. Those were the last words they spoke to each other. James's horse came back without him around midday, and Clara's heart seized with terror. Will and Emma immediately set out to search, and they found James lying in the north pasture, his face peaceful, as though he had simply lain down to rest. Doc Harrison said later that his heart had given out, that it had probably been quick and painless. But for Clara, the pain was anything but quick. It was a vast, gaping wound that felt like it would never heal. The funeral was the largest Silver Creek had ever seen. People came from all over the county to pay their respects to James Holloway, the man who had built a successful ranch through hard work and integrity, who had treated everyone with respect, who had been a good husband and father and friend. Clara stood beside his grave, flanked by her children, and listened to the preacher talk about heaven and eternal rest. But all she could think about was the empty space in their bed, the silence where James's voice should be, The weeks after the funeral were the darkest of Clara's life. She went through the motions of living, cooking and cleaning and caring for the animals, but inside she felt hollow. Will ran the ranch and he did it well, but it was not the same. Nothing was the same without James. One evening, Clara sat in the rocking chair he had given her all those years ago, the chair where she had rocked their babies and watched the mountains and dreamed about the future. She looked at the empty space where James used to sit, and the grief overwhelmed her. She bent over, sobbing, her whole body shaking with the force of her pain. "Mama!" Clara looked up to find Sarah standing in the doorway, her face full of concern. She came and knelt beside the chair, taking Clara's hands in hers. "I can know it hurts," Sarah said softly. "But Papa would not want you to give up. He loved you so much. He would want you to keep living, to keep being the strong woman he always said you were." Clara wiped at her tears. "I do not feel strong, I feel broken." "You are not broken," Sarah said firmly. "You are grieving. There is a difference. You and Papa had something special, something most people never find. It makes sense that losing him hurts this much. But you are still here, Mama. You still have Will and me. You have a grandson and probably more grandchildren to come. You have this ranch that you and Papa built together. That is not nothing." Clara pulled her daughter close, holding her tight. "When did you get so wise?" she asked, managing a watery smile. "I learned from the best," Sarah said. Slowly, painfully, Clara began to heal. She would never stop missing James, never stop wishing for one more conversation, one more sunset together, one more day. But she found ways to keep living. She threw herself into her garden, expanding it until it covered nearly an acre. She spent time with her grandson, teaching him letters and numbers the way she had taught his father. She helped Emma learn to manage a ranch household, passing on the skills she had acquired over the years. And she continued to make her preserves, winning ribbons at the county fair and selling them to supplement the ranch income. Will proved to be an excellent rancher, with his father's steady nature and his mother's attention to detail. Under his management, the ranch continued to prosper. He added more cattle, bought a few more horses, and even experimented with raising sheep, though that venture was less successful. He was always respectful of Clara, asking her opinion and making sure she felt included in decisions, even though legally the ranch was now his. Sarah married her doctor, and they opened their practice in Silver Creek. True to her dreams, Sarah became known for her skill with animals, and people brought their sick livestock from miles around for her to treat. She was happy and fulfilled, and Clara was proud of the woman her daughter had become. 10 years after James died, Clara was 60 years old. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but she was still active and engaged with life. She had 6 grandchildren now, and another on the way, and she loved spending time with them, telling them stories about their grandfather and the early days of the ranch. One summer evening, Clara sat on the porch, watching the sunset as she had done thousands of times before. Will came and sat beside her, and for a while they just sat in companionable silence. "You ever think about Pa?" Will asked quietly. "Every D-Day," Clara said. "Not a D-Day goes by that I do not think about him." "I miss him too," Will said. "But I am glad I got the chance to learn from him, to work beside him. He taught me so much about how to be a man, how to treat people, how to live with integrity." Clara nodded. "He was a good man, the best I ever knew. He loved you something fierce," Will continued. "I remember when I was little, before I really understood what love was, watching the way he looked at you, like you were the most precious thing in the world." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not entirely sad tears. "He made me feel like I mattered," she said. "Like my sin Stutter did not define me, like I was someone worth loving. He gave me a chance when no one else would. He gave me a life." "You gave him a life too," Will said gently. "You made a home for him, raised his children, stood beside him through everything." "It went both ways, Ma." Clara thought about that as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. She supposed Will was right. It had been a partnership, a true joining of two lives into something greater than either could have achieved alone. She and James had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were both gone. As Clara aged into her 70s, she became the matriarch of a large and loving family. Will and Emma had 4 children, Sarah and her husband had 3, and there were numerous great-grandchildren as well. The ranch had expanded and modernized with new buildings and better equipment, but at its heart, it was still the place Clara and James had built together. Clara's stutter never improved, and in fact it got worse as she aged, especially when she was tired. But by then, it truly did not matter. Everyone who knew her simply accepted it as part of who she was, and no one seemed to mind waiting for her to finish her sentences. She was known throughout the county as a woman of wisdom and compassion, someone people turned to for advice or comfort. On her 75th birthday, the family threw Clara a party at the ranch. It seemed like half the county showed up, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Clara sat in a place of honor, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and looked around at all the faces she loved. "Thank you," she said, her voice wavering but clear. "Thank you for making an old W woman feel so loved." "You are loved, Grandma," one of her great-granddaughters piped up. "You are the best grandma in the whole world." That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Clara sat in her rocking chair and looked out at the mountains. They were the same mountains she had seen when she first arrived in Montana Territory all those years ago, eternal and unchanging. But everything else had changed. That frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach had become a woman of strength and purpose. That rough ranch house had become a warm and welcoming home. That business arrangement had become the greatest love story Clara could have imagined. She thought about James, about his kindness and his patience, about the way he had seen her when she felt invisible. She thought about his words, spoken so long ago but still as meaningful today. "Every word of yours matters." He had believed that, truly believed it, and he had made her believe it too. "I miss you," she whispered into the darkness, "but I am grateful. For every moment, every day, every year we had tea together. You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give. You gave me a life worth living." The wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. Clara closed her eyes and let the peace of the moment wash over her. She had lived a good life, a full life. She had known love and loss, joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat. She had built something lasting, not just in the physical ranch but in the family she had raised and the community she had served. As Clara entered her 80s, her health began to decline. The arthritis that had plagued her for years grew worse, and she had difficulty walking. She spent most of her days in her rocking chair, watching the life of the ranch go on around her. But her mind was still sharp, and she loved when her grandchildren and great-grandchildren came to visit, climbing into her lap to hear stories about the old days. She told them about the Wild West as it had been, about the dangers and the hardships, but also about the beauty and the freedom. She told them about their grandfather, about his strength and his gentleness, about how he had loved the land and the life they had built together. And sometimes, when she was feeling particularly nostalgic, she told them about a young woman with a stutter who had been brave enough to travel across the country for a chance at love. One crisp autumn morning, Clara woke feeling different. There was no pain, which was unusual, and she felt light, almost as though she could float. She got up slowly and made her way to the window, looking out at the land she had come to love so deeply. The leaves on the few trees around the house had turned gold and red, and the grass had that particular tawny color it got in the fall. The mountains stood in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. It was beautiful. It was home. Clara felt a presence beside her, and she turned to see James standing there, looking just as he had when they first met. Young and strong, with those hazel eyes that had seen her so clearly. He smiled and held out his hand. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the warmth of his skin. I have been ready for years, she said and smiled. I missed you. I missed you too, James said, but you did good, Clara. You lived well, loved well. I am proud of you. They walked together out the door, and Clara felt herself getting lighter with each step. Behind her, she could hear stirring in the house, footsteps and worried voices. She knew they had found her body, knew they were grieving, but it was all right. She had lived a long life, a good life, and she had left them with love and memories and the foundation of something strong. As she walked away with James, hand in hand, Clara looked back one last time at the ranch. She saw Will coming out of the house, his face stricken with grief, and Emma trying to comfort him. She saw Sarah arriving, her medical bag in hand, too late to help. She saw her grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathering, drawn by some instinct that something important had happened. "They will be all right," she said to James. "They will," he agreed. "You taught them well. You and me, we built something that will last for generations." And then they were walking into light, into warmth, into a place where there was no more pain or sorrow or separation. Clara's stutter fell away like a shed skin, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Take me home," she said. "You are home," James replied. "You have always been home wherever we are together." And so they walked on, two souls reunited into whatever lay beyond. Back at the ranch, the family mourned. They buried Clara beside James in the small cemetery on the hill with a simple marker that read Clara Whitmore Holloway, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Every word mattered. The ranch continued under Will's management and eventually passed to his children and then to their children. It remained in the Holloway family for generations, a testament to what Clara and James had built together. The story of the mail-order bride with a stutter and the cowboy who loved her became part of family legend, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. But for those who had known Clara, who had seen her strength and her grace, who had witnessed the love between her and James, it was not a myth. It was a true story, a beautiful story of two people who found each other across the miles and built a life together in the Wild West. It was a story of acceptance and patience, of seeing beyond surface imperfections to the person underneath. It was a story of hard work and dedication, of facing challenges together and never giving up. Most of all, it was a love story. And like all the best love stories, it was one that lasted beyond death, beyond time, beyond anything that could separate two hearts that had found their home in each other. The end.